Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being on time. Well, we begin. Adam, how is everything looking at Mound House today?
Things are looking great at Mound House here on Fort Myers Beach. Uh, Partly cloudy, a brisk 87. We had our front come through. So it's a little bit nicer being outside this week than previous weeks. It's cooled off a little bit. The Mound House looks pretty good, museum wise and landscaping wise. The town of Fort Myers Beach has done a lot of work in rehabilitating the site and getting the town back to normal. And it's I mean, as you know, Nat, the shell mound that the museum is built on here, the cultural resources really protected and saved the museum building, the historical resources, as well as all the artifacts. This building I'm in. Night and day, if you look at the Mound House property and other areas of the island that are still recovering from Hurricane Ian. But slowly but surely, things are getting a little bit better.
I'm glad. Yes. I'm glad that, everything is, the recovery process is ongoing and is going well, and that the weather is getting more, nicer to be outside and enjoy the beautiful view and the kayaking and all of that, which it has been a challenge with the hottest summer we've ever had in over like 100,000 years. So I'm really glad.
Yes.
And everybody that is here already in the call, if you haven't tried it out already, Mound House has incredible tours and events and kayak tours that are incredible if you want to like really explore and experience Estero Bay. It's wonderful and highly recommend. And that being said, I think it's already 11:05. So I hope everybody has their cafecito or coffee ready. And if everybody can hear me well, you can? Okay, awesome. Everybody can hear me well, so I can officially and formally welcome everybody to our second virtual Cafecito lecture. This is part of the Honrando Nuestra Historia series of events hosted by the Florida Public Archaeology Network during National Hispanic Heritage Month, which runs from September 15th to October 15th. So we invite you to explore our website for detailed information about all of these events, their purpose, more if they're happening in person all over South Florida, but also virtually with events like the Cafecito lectures. And today we are honored to have with us Adam Knight, who is the museum manager at Mound House for the town of Fort Myers Beach, Florida. And they have worked at Mound House since 2020 and previously worked at the Edison and Fort Winter Estates between 2016 and 2020 as their lead historian. Adam's interest is building community-centered museums and interpreting Latine and LGBTQIA histories in their native Southwest Florida. So feel free to ask questions on the chat, but know that at the end, Adam will be available to answer any questions you may have. Welcome, Adam, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And this presentation is very personal to me. It's the whole reason this topic I'm going to be discussing is the whole reason I actually decided to initially apply for my first position as a museum educator way back in 2020. It's because of this history. This history I'll be discussing, this Latina history here, that you don't, that is rarely present and documented. It is here. U.S. Latina history is all throughout Southwest Florida. U.S. Latinas are the reason Southwest Florida is here. It's very personal to me as well. I'm Puerto Rican. My father is from Puerto Rico, and my mother, she's descended of Anglo-American settlers of Florida. So I always had that two world view when it came to just my daily life, but also in visiting museums or going places. like the Mound House. So I've always had an interest in Latina history, just because I just didn't really see it well documented growing up here. I saw history that of people that looked like my mother's side of the family, but nothing that looked like my father's side of the family, which was always very strange, whenever there's towns like Boca Grande and Punta Gorda in my native Charlotte County. So I always thought it was a weird disconnect between, we have all these place names and history and the conquistadors and Ponce de Leon. There's a statue of Ponce de Leon and a park named after him in Punta Gorda, but it kind of ended there. And it was actually my first visit to the Mound House before I worked here. It was 2018 when I saw this exhibit that's behind me discussing the early U.S. Latine settlers at the Mound House site. So I'm really excited that this has really come full circle from my initial visit and kind of growing up here, learning about Latina history, to sharing what I've learned and the research that I've done in not just the history, but also the how, the interpretation, the context, more than the content, is really what I'll be discussing, really what I'm really interested in. But of course, I'll discuss the content for the majority of this presentation, because it's a not really understood, and as you'll see in one slide, a bit confusing time period and people group we'll be discussing. So as Natalie said, I'm the museum manager at Mound House. And just to give you a little background on the Mound House itself, the Mound House is on Fort Myers Beach. Here's an aerial view of Mound House. It is at the bottom of this circular photograph. The museum itself is that large, prominent building in the middle of the grassy field. The grassy field surrounded by that white shell drive at the bottom of your screen. That is the shell mound. The Mound House is a natural history museum. It may just look like a house, but it's actually a museum housed within a historic house. So we're a very multifaceted place, very special place. Our mission is to preserve, share, and interpret 2,000 years of cultural and environmental history of Fort Myers Beach in Southwest Florida. We have numerous resources. We, of course, have the shell mound, which makes our site so special and prominent. And if you're here in the beginning part of the lecture, really is what saved the museum building itself and the various artifacts, along with it, that historic house, the restored 1921 historic house. And I always like to joke, we have the 3 C's of Mound House, as I've been saying. Calusa, Cuban, Case. The Case family being the people that built and lived in the house first. So we have indigenous, Latine, and Anglo history and cultures represented at our site, all living at the same site, all same 3 acres. So it's a very special, unique place right on Estero Bay. As Natalie was promoting, you can come visit and, of course, also go kayaking into our neighboring Estero Bay. Now, my interest was really in that middle period, the Cuban history, or as it's often called, or the Latina history, which is a more accurate term to describe this time period and culture group. We have the mound, we have the house, it's in our name, Mound House. We have the mound's history to the best of our abilities, and archaeology's abilities, and oral history's abilities. And we have the house's history, extremely well documented and abundant information on the last 50 years of the 2,000 years of history that we're interpreting and preserving. So really, I was interested in this kind of middle period, the Latina history, after this was a Clusive village, but before this was an Anglo-American homestead and historic house, this Latina history of the Rancho. Now, what is a rancho? So if you go out west, like in Arizona, California, northern Mexico, you'll find ranchos. People live on ranchos. They're very rural, small towns, sometimes just a single house. I mean, it literally means ranch, or ranch, and in English. So it gets a little confusing. Like, what are you talking about? I don't see any cattle ranches. We're a small barrier island in Florida. But the terminology of rancho, they weren't herding cattle, but they're actually herding fish. Actually a photograph of one of the more prominent fishes here in Southwest Florida. And interesting side note, used by all 3 of those, and important to all 3 of those cultures of our sites, Calusa, Latine, and Anglo. The mullet. Mullet, they're found throughout the Caribbean and even into the Mediterranean. So These ranchos, they were herding mullet, red drum, pompano, flounder, sheep's head mullet, some sharks, coastal fish that you find here in our back bays and estuaries along Southwest Florida. And these ranchos, the Rancho de Pescadores, the fishing ranchos, or fishermen's ranches, really started. There's some evidence that they may have started as early as the late 1500s, but it is confirmed that there is actual presence of these ranchos of Latine settlers by 1680. At first, these were seasonal, but as we'll soon learn, they become established permanent towns. And maybe the name rancho and the uses of the term rancho kind of discredits the permanency of these US Latines and thus the permanency of Latina history and the longevity of Latina history in Florida. They were called ranchos because initially they were seasonal, but they do become towns. One of the largest ranchos, what is today on Usepa Island, or formerly was on Usepa Island, had a population between 200 and 300 people. So if you're learning about other local histories, 200, 300 people, that's a small town in what many people see as early pioneer history, but in this history, it's actually much later. 3 or 4 generations later, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, very famous, coming down to Fort Myers. When Thomas Edison arrived in 1885, Fort Myers only had about 350 people. So these were pretty sizable populated areas that we'll be discussing. And another point of confusion, so those individual structures that you see in this photograph, this is of course not a Latino rancho, but a very similar structure architecturally to the ranchos built by later Anglo-Americans using palmetto, a native palm, to thatch the roofing and siding. So you have indigenous building practices carried on by US Latines and or even early Anglo-American settlers. Usually they're small, single room, maybe a hammock, small cot, some shelves, few personal items. So a very rural area here in Southwest Florida still, but quite populated. The communities themselves would be called ranchos, and also the individual houses would be called ranchos. Think of it like condos. There are condos and condos. So there are ranchos and ranchos. So where are we actually talking about? So Southwest Florida, or as the history of this area is mostly called the Costa de Campa. We're talking about a huge area, the original indigenous lands from the Tocobaga, Calusa, Muspa, Matacumbe people, some of the Tequesta people, really centered here on the Southwest Florida coast between Tampa Bay and Key West. Key West wasn't around, neither was Tampa, Miami, St. Petersburg. So those cities that you see in black, those black circles, St. Pete, Miami, Key West, they weren't around at the time. Key West wasn't established until 1820, so the tail end of this time period. Havana, if you look on the map, very, very close to Florida. It's very recent that Florida and Cuba have had a disconnected history. Calusa and early Latina settlers. A lot of the businesses were conducted in Havana. Havana was the nearest big town. And you can see in red, I have labeled in the next 2 maps in the center and on the right, you have really the well-established ranchos. Multiple families, usually these would actually be set up by corporations, fishing companies that would actually send out and hire men to sail north for the season, set up a camp, catch all these fish, come back to Havana and sell it at a high point of season when the fishing was most profitable, usually during Lent. Not a lot of protein sources on Cuba, and during Lent, prohibition against eating meat, majority Catholic practitioners. So you have fish being a very important commodity during Lent for the majority Catholic Cuba, Spanish colonial Cuba. So you have up further north in Tampa Bay, Tarrasia, Sarasota, Cayo, and then northern part of Charlotte County. You have Cayo Palau, and then Cayo Tio Zespa. That is actually what is today Usepa Island. More on that later. And that photograph on the right, you can see down where we are at the very, very bottom, the Estero Rancho. So the Rancho de Estero, or the Estero Rancho, it was one of the prominent ranchos of the four major ranchos. We don't have a lot of data. There hasn't been any formal archaeological digs or excavations on these ranchos, very limited information. The vast majority of archaeological work in Southwest Florida, from what I have found, has been mainly focused on historic Anglo-American archaeology and indigenous Calusa archaeology. So this time period, not a lot of data on these sources, especially as many of these ranchos were settled on top of former Calusa archaeological, or what I say, Calusa archaeological sites or middens. But you can see pretty sizable population. The U.S. Census by 1820 or 1830, excuse me, estimated there's as many as 400 to 600 people year-round living in the ranchos. You also see the town of Angola. Angola was not a rancho, but was a major source of wage labor that the ranchos would hire the self-emancipated Africans and people of African descent living in Angola, what is basically Bradenton, Florida. And they would work especially in the northern ranchos like Tercia and the various ranchos of basically the Tampa Bay area. So as I said, a lot of these ranchos, they start off as seasonal, but they quickly move to permanent settlements. This really has a lot to do with other events in the world. Sometimes when you look at history, a lot of things, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, but a lot of this history comes from really outside of a vacuum. So you have it where events around the world are influencing the settlement patterns here in Florida. Most especially the 7 Years' War. That was a huge turning point. The 7 Years' War saw the British occupy the city of Havana, pearl of the Spanish Empire. That was basically the layover point. I like to joke it's kind of like the Atlanta of its day. Spanish ships would arrive from Spain, from Europe, stop in Havana, refuel, resupply, change crews, and then go to their final destinations that really attracted a lot of Spanish colonization. So Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and then of course extract the resources through colonization from indigenous people, from enslaved Africans working in those colonies to exploit resources for Spain back to Europe. And again, they would stop at Havana, change crews, get resources, get supplied, and then continue on way back to Spain. So the capture of Havana was a huge strategic and military loss for Spain itself, to the point that at the end of the treaty, Spain had ceded the entirety of Florida to Britain just to get Havana back. But in those several years that Britain owned Havana, they imported 10,000 enslaved people to continue basically a form of looting. They imported 10,000 enslaved people to Havana and basically to quicken up the sugar harvest, and then basically loot the sugar harvest from the Spanish and then sell that sugar into the market. Very expensive commodity, sugar. So whenever the British handed Havana back over to Spain, they left those 10,000 enslaved people in Havana. So sugar and a slave-based economy becomes really the mainstay of Cuba, which again, this is where the majority of the ranchos are coming from, as well, or majority of the money that are supporting the ranchos, and the majority of where the ranchos are going to sell their catches. So you see this huge increase in demand, kind of supply and demand. There's a huge supply in Southwest Florida of fish, especially coastal fish caught by these ranchos that have become pretty much seasonal. And there's a huge demand for cheap, especially easily transported protein sources, fish that people, most notably enslavers, would buy from the ranchos and the fishmongers in Havana and transport to the rural mountain sugar and coffee plantations that are being grown by enslaved African labor. So you have really this cause and effect, butterfly effect, that's, 7 Years' War really, and demand caused by that has a huge number of mestizos going from Cuba and setting up and living in these ranchos. And really, not only is it profitable during Lent to sell salted dried fish, but year-round. And you have marriage between the mostly male mestizos, indigenous European-born Cubans and Spanish Cubans, as well as a vast majority of indigenous Muskogee-speaking people. So we're talking about Seminole ancestors, ancestral Seminole, historic Seminole peoples, other indigenous peoples. There's some archaeological and historical evidence of, or rather historical evidence of indigenous people, Maya speakers from Mexico, coming and settling in the ranchos as well. So even though we're talking about a very rural, kind of the edge of the Spanish Empire, these ranchos here in the Costa de Tampa, the Southwest Florida area, were still very much a part of the broader Spanish Empire. So exchanges of peoples and ideas. And you have, again, these becoming permanent by 1763. So 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as it's often discussed in the United States, and really up until the 1840s. These are permanent towns established up and down the Southwest Florida coast. So more of who these people were. This next slide, you may call it a glimpse. It looks like a lot, but this is probably the best way. This is why I love PowerPoint presentations to discuss this. I really need to make a printout. It's ever changing, basically who these people were. So again, I know it looks like a lot, but this basically explains the effects of colonization in a flowchart of people, ethnicities, culture, language. So if you start at the top and move down, it's moving down through time. You can see along the left-hand side, the top, we're talking about the first Spanish period. So Spanish contact, 1565, the establishment of San Agustin, up until that 7 Years' War period. Then you have an awkward 20-year red period in the middle, which is when a lot of these ranchos really start flourishing and becoming well established during the British period. Then you have the second Spanish period, and then finally the US period, 1821 to present. So a lot, again, you have a lot of indigenous peoples, Miccosukee, Muskogee, Calusa, Tequesta, all indigenous peoples of Florida come together and basically do the forces of genocide and colonization. They form the Seminole. There's an ethnogenesis. I highly recommend you learn more about the Seminole by visiting Apatiki Museum and researching them and visiting their museum. They do an amazing job interpreting their history as well as their living culture. You also have people of African descent, like Angola that I spoke of earlier, people living in Florida, Africans coming from the Spanish Empire. You have mestizos, again, mostly indigenous, European, mixed peoples, part of the Spanish racialized caste system. And they're coming down, and this intermarriage between really the mestizos and historic Seminole, more the historic Seminoles living along the coast, Hispanophile, speaking Spanish, converting to Catholicism, broadly assimilating into Spanish culture. You really have what's known in archaeology and anthropology as a Creolization, the forming of a Creole culture. So you might be more familiar with the Creole or Cajun culture of Louisiana. Similar process, but different people that we're talking about. So sometimes you might even hear these people referred to as Spanish Indians. If you read literature or research this topic more, these are the Latines that I'm really discussing. And I'll explain in the next slide why I use the term Latines instead of Creoles or Spanish Indians or other terms. And you can really see, as a result of the US acquisition of Florida, there's a complete disruption of these ranchos. Those that were phenotypically or in terms of appearance looked white based on US racial caste systems, assimilated into whiteness. Felipe became Philip, Juan became John, etc. You have indigenous people and even some people who had intermarried, have actually European or mestizo background, were forcibly removed with other indigenous peoples by the United States government to places like Oklahoma. And then you have other of these Latines assimilating, and as a result of the majority of the ranchos being indigenous, during the Seminole War with the U.S. War of aggression against the Seminole and other indigenous peoples and people of African descent in Florida, you have resistance forming and the kind of the reconnecting of the historic Seminole that lived more inland and more traditional lifestyle, speaking Muskogee and Hitichi languages, with the Spanish-speaking Latines forming. So so in terms of where these people are today, the culture has changed, just like the Seminole and indigenous peoples have changed. You have the Latines living in these ranchos. The culture is gone in a sense, but the people survive. So there are descendants still living in Southwest Florida, both as descendants of U.S. settlers, the descendants of Seminole, Miccosukee, other indigenous people here in Florida and Oklahoma. So just with like many other cultures, you have this culture kind of collapse amongst the ranchos, but you do have the people living on through their descendants. So why am I using the term Latines? Why am I not using Creole or Spanish Indians or Cuban? So first of all, I try to stress also the usage of Latine over Latino. So there's a huge debate amongst, the nonprofit world, the culture world, within and without the Latina community. First of all, is it Hispanic? Is it Latino, Latinx, Latina, Latine? All these different endings. Spanish being a gender-based language, sort of similar to English and other languages, but more prominent and more established than English, for example. So Latino, male, Latina, female, Latine, gender neutral, also Latinx. Latinx has gotten most of the media attention and some backlash in terms of the usage of Latinx. So instead of the O or the A at the end, it's an X at the end. So there's been a lot of backlash between that. Some main critiques of Latinx is that it doesn't fit in Spanish, but is Spanish really the core of what it means to be Latina? I mean, I'm Latine. I'm not fluent in Spanish. And really, Latine goes within that tries to separate that language aspect that Hispanic has. Hispanic is more based in language. So, for example, people in Spain are Hispanic, people in Mexico, Hispanic, Brazilians, Portuguese speakers, Haitian Creole speakers, not Hispanic. They do not speak Spanish. So Brazilians are not Hispanic, but being in Latin America, the basis of Latino or Latine, Latinx, they are Latine. Spaniards, because they're not in Latin America, for example, they are not Latino or Latine. But again, that's a very broad definition. People choose how to identify themselves based on different experiences. This does not reflect everyone's experiences or how everyone chooses to identify themselves in their groups. So you have a huge influence, just like in everyday life. In identity is complicated. There are different perspectives, all equally valid. But for myself, I identify as Latine. I'm non-binary, so I don't fit within the dynamics of Latino, Latina. Latine is what I choose to identify with. I used to identify as Hispanic when I was younger, but as Latino became more prominent, as I got older, I chose to identify as Latino, and then I came out as non-binary, then I was Latinx. Then I found Latine works a little bit better just in terms of speaking for myself personally. So there's a huge debate between Latine and Latinx. But I figure in terms of interpretation, just pick one. Just be consistent. Latine is more inclusive, not just in gender, but also geography. So again, we're talking about the majority of the people in the ranchos were not male. The majority of the people living in the ranchos were actually female. So it'd actually be more correct to say Latina ranchos. And then also we have to accept that people living outside of a Western gendered binary, so transgender individuals, especially from an indigenous perspective, two-spirit individuals have existed in Florida for thousands of years. There's documentation of Calusa and indigenous people living in Florida during Spanish colonization, adopting what many would refer to as a two-spirit, or in terms of Western lens, a transgender identity. So Latine, so we're not just, imposing this thoughts of today onto past peoples with the usage of, non-gendered language, the usage of Latinx or Latine, but also, the words Hispanic and Latino, they're very new. Hispanic was basically invented by the United States Census in the 1970s. Latino along the same time, more of a grassroots method rather than a U.S. Census method for Latino. So these terms that we're even, debating about in terms of identity, they're only 50 years old. So we also have to keep that in mind, that language is continuing to grow and we can just continue updating this. And Latino, we're in Florida. So Florida, I consider Florida a part of Latin America. It was a part of Spain, and really the west coast of Florida, the Costa de Tampa, was administered by Havana. It wasn't really administered by St. Augustine. And the presence of people from Cuba and throughout the Spanish Empire, and the really being indigenous really central to the Rancho reality and the Rancho experience. But also, you want to take it even farther. This is a fun thought experiment. I won't get into it too much. Mexico, Brazil, a lot of people leave Haiti, Creole, French Creole speakers out of Latin America and the Latino or Latina identity. But also you have English speakers. Where do we draw the line? Is French speakers okay because it's considered part of the Latin language family? But why not Belize? Again, language isn't central to these identities, especially indigenous speakers. Quechua speakers in Peru and Nahuatl speakers in Mexico and Maya speakers in Mexico and the Muskogee speakers here in Florida, are they less Latino because they don't speak Spanish as a first language? So, trying to remove the language aspect is very important. So geography. So Florida, Arizona, parts of the Spanish Empire, I consider those parts of Latin America. Borders changed, people didn't. And then this one's a real fun thought experiment. Is Quebec a part of Latin America? I'll let you all decide for yourselves and think about that one. If Haiti is part of Latin America, why not Quebec? And then also this perspective of US Latine, not just Latine. You have, as I'll discuss in the next slide, citizenship is a central part to this story and this interpretation. It's a very difficult part of the story, but it is a necessary part of the story. When the United States acquired Florida, these people were U.S. citizens. They weren't, sometimes when you read writings about this time period, they'll say, oh, the United States didn't like foreigners or Cubans in their waters. These people were registered U.S. seamen in the ports of Key West, in Tampa. They voted. They participated civically. They were translators. They were hired by the military. Some of them were in the military. So they were full U.S. citizens based on really a treaty. So, I'm not a constitutional law expert or a law expert by any means, but based on the treaty, the Ranchos went from Spanish subjects to U.S. citizens pretty much overnight. And that citizenship was stripped away from those peoples. U.S. citizenship was taken away from people who were born in the United States. Now, this is again before the 14th Amendment, when birthright citizenship became law of the land. So it was a different mindset, and really U.S.-based citizenship was again a racial-based citizenship. So there's a lot of complicating factors, but in terms of the writing of the treaty, these were U.S. citizens. They voted, they were in the military. So there's a lot of different perspectives in this that I always like to highlight. So I usually try to stress Latine. Oftentimes Latinos, Latines, Latinas are othered. They're not seen as American as Anglo-Americans. In terms of museums and how we preserve our history, when you learn U.S. history, there's always a shift and a drive to focus on, Plymouth Rock and Jamestown, but you don't have the histories and the perspective of Florida and New Mexico. So it'd be interesting to see Florida and US history told through a Latino perspective rather than an Anglo-American perspective. So trying to center Latinos and Latinas into the broader American narrative. Because again, Latina is a label that's really would not exist without the United States. So that's a huge other discussion as well. So here's this treaty I was telling you about. You can read it for yourselves, but it is Article 6 of the Adam-Onis Treaty. That's the treaty that Spain ceded Florida to the United States, negotiated between the secretaries of those respective countries, John Quincy Adams and Luis Onis. So as you can see, in the principles of the Constitution, they would be admitted to the privileges, rights, and immunities of citizens of the United States. But then you have, again, this language that, sure, even the admission by then Colonel George Brooks, who was the founder of the Fort of Tampa and thus the city of Tampa, when he was a general 20 years later. Then Colonel George Brooks admitted during the targeting and the removal of the Latines at the Ranchos that they were certainly citizens, but still foreigners at heart. And that was based on their close social and economic ties to the Seminole in the more inland portions of Cuba, the more inland portions of Florida, and Cuba itself. So I'm curious if General George Brooks considered Americans British because of their close social and economic ties to the United Kingdom based on trade in the 1820s. I'm sure he wouldn't agree with that notion, but that seems like his line of thinking. So really, these ranchos pose a huge challenge. As I said, U.S. citizenship was based on a race-based class system of white and not white. So these people who were this third category, not necessarily indigenous, not necessarily African, not necessarily European, did not really fit, especially the presence of free and self-emancipated people of African descent living and working within the ranchos for wage labor really threatened the expansion of the United States into Florida. The economic growth of the United States was really fueled by slavery, not just the South, but the entirety of the United States was fueled by slavery, the acquisition of stolen land through wars and conquest, and then the industry moving in after those military conflicts and establishing plantations worked by stolen labor from enslaved people of African descent on the land of indigenous peoples. So Florida was just another stepping stone in that manifest destiny of the United States from towards the Pacific, as it would later become called manifest destiny a generation later from this time period. So really, the theory was, or the thought process was, how can the United States run a strict racial hierarchy of white and enslaved, not citizen, not white individuals, enslaved Africans, when just a few miles away, there are people of African and indigenous backgrounds living in freedom and really flourishing. So these pose a real threat to the United States and really was the catalyst for the Seminole War. But you have other people moving into Florida. When the United States acquired Florida in 1821, you have a large number of people from North Carolina and New England, particularly fishermen, moving to especially the new founded city, 1820, of Key West. So you have Key West being established as a port, made the official point of entry. Many of these Latinos registered as American seamen. At Key West, they were registered sailors, their boats were registered. And the Florida territorial government, based out of Tallahassee, really was trying to boost and promote the settlement of Florida of Northerners to move down to this new territory of Florida. You can have land, you can have fishing rights. There's all these economic opportunities, mostly based on agriculture and fishing. And you see not just the encouragement of Anglo-Americans, but the restriction of Latines in Florida. The territorial government actually passes an anti-rancho law that, quote, non-Americans from working, fishing, or operating boats in Florida. Not only was this law vehemently opposed by, of course, the Latines working in the ranchos, but a lot of these Latines had worked and had really lived side by side with these new Anglo-American settlers moving down from New England and North Carolina, forming deep friendships. They were showing them the fishing spots, the fishing lanes, helping them map and navigate the areas, establishment of places like Sarasota, Key West, of course, Bradenton. They provided a huge economic boost in terms of taxation. They were the majority. So, of course, they were providing the majority of the taxes, especially tariffs, because they were still exporting fish to Spanish Cuba and Havana. So it's a huge, huge boom in terms of tax revenue and economic boosting of these areas that really made settlement so attractive that the Florida territorial government could advertise this land to those New England and North Carolinian and Anglo-American settlers. But this law, it was really opposed by all peoples. It was kind of pushed through 1832. It backfires because, again, the Latines living in the ranchos were U.S. citizens. They were registered seamen in the United States. However, these new Anglo-Americans that were moving to Florida, that were being promoted to do so, they came with their boats, but they had no crews. So oftentimes they would go to British Bahamas and hire seasonal laborers to work in U.S. territorial waters. So they would actually being prevented from running their crew. So it was actually not an anti-rancho law. It actually became an anti-Anglo-American fishing law, because now these Anglo-American fishers couldn't hire your Bahamian and British Bahamian and other English-speaking Caribbean workers. So it was basically just them and their boats, no crews. So soon the law was repealed once the effects became known. Actually, one of the most prominent ranchos was an Anglo-American rancho. Instead of fishing for the deep water fish of other Anglo-Americans like grouper out in the Gulf and the open waters, William Bruce, who was a signer of the first Florida Constitution, he actually started a very prominent rancho at the Manatee River, and also owned another large rancho, what is today in Fort DeSoto National, I think it's a national landmark site. You can see ruins, part of a concrete house that's believed to be associated with the rancho operated by William Bruce. So, as I said, the Seminole War, tensions have been building between the Florida territorial government, the United States government to a lesser degree. And you can see this quote that captures the commander of the armed forces in Florida, Major General Thomas Jessup, in 1863, stating that this isn't necessarily a war against the Seminole, as the goal was to remove Seminole and other indigenous people from Florida, but it was rather to put down any fears by the dominant U.S. planter lobbyists in the government and in the military to basically capture any freed, self-emancipated, formerly enslaved person of African background living here in Florida. And you kind of see these ranchos, the Latines, kind of caught in the middle. When the war breaks out, these ranchos, they kind of distance themselves from the Seminole for a long time. And you see the Seminole actually raid Yusef Island. The U.S. Navy is deployed to actually protect the ranchos, but only a couple years after the U.S. Seminole War goes very poorly for the United States. Some of you might be familiar with how the Vietnam War was perceived and how it became kind of a quagmire and dragged on and was a waste of resources for really no real gain. The U.S. Seminole War is extremely, extremely unpopular amongst the U.S. press and the media. And whenever a large number of Seminole and other indigenous people had been captured and held in the internment camps set up by the United States government in Tampa at Fort Brooke, a huge escape was launched. And basically the ranchos were seen as the fall guys. The U.S. military blamed the ranchos for arming and supplying and informing U.S. troop activities to the Seminole. The U.S. Navy, who once protected the ranchos, suddenly came in and started attacking and raiding the ranchos themselves. There's one account whereby the U.S. Navy waited for all the men to go out fishing that morning, leaving mostly women and children at the ranchos. They came in on their small boats and basically took everyone by surprise, kidnapped people, burned the homes, burned trading posts, destroyed crops, poisoned water supplies. And when captured, they were asked if they could take, personal belongings, food or water. They were denied taking any personal belongings. The U.S. soldiers basically only allowed them to take the clothes on their back if they had any. One of the surviving Latines, Antonio Nequeca or Chacaca, he actually joined the Seminole. He's very famous at the Battle of the Caloosahatchee, right at the base of the Cape Coral Bridge on the Cape Coral side, Harney's Point. That's where Chacaca defeated the United States military in a small skirmish there. But eventually he would be captured in 1842 and executed. Again, a U.S. soldier executed by the military without trial. You have, again, people of European and background and appearances kind of assimilating into this new racialized hierarchy of U.S. Florida, of white and not white. Indigenous people are not allowed, and people of African background are enslaved. So extremely, extremely difficult time. You really see this is the second emptying of Florida. The first emptying of Florida was during the 1700s with very similar situations: slave raids, disease, the collapse of indigenous peoples, cultures, and governments like the Calusa, Tocobaga, Appalachee, Timucuan by Spanish, British, and Americans. So you see this huge depopulation in the 1700s, a small repopulation with the Latines, and then a second depopulation, an emptying of the land. So when Anglo-Americans came here, they did not arrive to empty land. They had arrived to twice emptied land. So that's a very key distinction to make. So what are the legacy of these ranchos? What are the legacy of the Latines? So we have, of course, most notably the place names. As I discussed earlier, those place names, some of them are, very clever developers trying to sell a slice of the Florida dream or the Caribbean dream to new transplants to Florida. Developments with Spanish place names. Developments like San Carlos Park are founded in the 1960s, basically taken from San Carlos Bay nearby. But that bay, San Carlos Bay, along with Punta Gorda, Punta Rosas, Ustepa, Sanibel, Cayo Costa, Estero, those are all Spanish place names of the ranchos. Not of Ponce de Leon. He wasn't here that long to really name too many things. But it was really the legacy of the U.S. Latine settlers, not of Spanish conquistadors, why we have a lot of Spanish place names in Florida. It is the work of the Latino settlers who boosted and provided the economic necessity for really the settlement and the founding and establishment of Tampa, Key West, Bradenton. These huge tariffs infused the Florida territorial government with a huge amount of much needed revenue to fund the boosting and development of U.S. occupied Florida, especially Key West. But after the Civil War, this family that you see at the top, that's the Padilla family. Rubio Padilla and his was from the Canary Islands. He moved to Cuba, and shortly there in Cuba married his wife Juanita, who is just to his left. She was originally from Mexico, living in Havana when she met Rubio, and they married, and they had, as you see, quite the kids and family. They actually established on another island of Cayo Costa, near Boca Grande in the Charlotte Harbor area. And that rancho actually existed in some form or another until 1947. So almost another 80 years of what's known as the second rancho period. It really stopped operating to its full capacity after the 1922 hurricane. Damaged a lot of nets and unfortunately killed a lot of the workers who were living at the Padilla Rancho on Cayo Costa. But the Padilla family lived on Calacasa until the 1940s when it became a state park. And then the Padilla family still work and live in the area. The Padilla family, one of them is a very prominent real estate agent here on Fort Myers Beach. And these ranchos, I said, place name, economic benefits. So without the ranchos, without these early U.S. Latina settlers, what we know of Southwest Florida would look very different and would surely be smaller, less developed, and not nearly as populated without the initial working, mapping, and knowledge and skills of the Latines. And there's actually some evidence that those fishing practices that the Calusa had were spread through their indigenous descendants amongst the Latines, again, mostly indigenous peoples living in the Latine ranchos, and continuing those fishing practices in the ranchos. And then that contact with the Anglo-American fishers from New England continued that fishing knowledges. So there's some Dr. Victor, professor at University of West Florida, his name is escaping me right now, but I'll remember it in a second. He argues that there appears to be an unbroken fishing practice from the Calusa to the Latinas to the people still fishing in Southwest Florida today. So Florida's, in terms of US history, extremely important. American commercial fishing really started in Southwest Florida. You might think Maine or Boston or England as like a big fishing hub. It is, but in terms of what's first, it appears that the ranchos really was the start of commercial fishing practices in what is today the United States. So huge, huge, huge influences today that influence our lives today as a result of these people who sadly are often and too often forgotten. So I'll open it up to questions. Feel free if you want me to go back to any of the slides.
Excellent parsing through very complex history and extremely well done as usual. I was struck by maybe even before you mentioned it at the end, how closely the this Rancho culture is to Southwest Florida fishing. And I didn't know that there was actually this family has a relatively strong presence still on Pine Island. I'm wondering, and then you mentioned that a prominent real estate agent, perhaps from this descent, is active in Fort Myers Beach. So you have had then any personal experience with anyone who claims some sort of heritage back to any of these ranchos? Have you had any personal experience with any of them?
Thank you, Dick, for the compliments. I have not had a chance to reach out to any members of the Padilla family. There has been other researchers who have had an interview with the Padilla family. There's actually not just the Padilla family, there's actually a brand new book that came out only last week on this Rancho period. I'm pulling it up now, but this, excuse me. The book that came out is The Spanish Seminole.
Mm-hmm.
And the author of this book, he is a descendant of the Sanibel Rancho. And he actually has reached out to me. I found his book. I was blown away that this book existed. But this book, he actually has the baptismal records of his grandmother, or his great-great-grandmother, who was born at the Sanibel Rancho. They were the Montes de Oca family. They were Spanish and Muskogee speakers, born on Sanibel. It's actually the first recorded birth on Sanibel Island in 1820. So I've had contact with him just actually 2 days ago. I discovered his book and have been speaking with him. This guy who he now lives in North Carolina, but he was born in Southwest Florida. His name is John Webb, and he actually used to run the Wonder Gardens. He was their former director until last year. So definitely some much needed conversations with him, as well as trying to reach out to the Padilla family. and continuing those legacies for sure.
I would just say it would be really cool to have someone who claims their heritage from the ranchos, particularly those in Southwest Florida, particularly those in the Fort Myers Beach area, and where the Calusa capital was, to have them actually at the Mound House someday. So thank you for that pursuit.
You're more than welcome. Yes, I agree. It'd be fantastic.
Thank you. Wonderful. Is there anybody else that has any questions? You can either go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can write it down on the comments, and we'll make sure to read it out loud. Well, in the meantime, Ken, I did have a question, Adam, and it is, what are the challenges that you have faced interpreting Latine or Latinx heritage here in Southwest Florida, and what has been something that has really
Yeah, so one of the main challenges when I first developed, when I started working at the Mound House, one of the challenges obviously has been money, as it always is in not the nonprofit cultural museum world. Exhibits are very expensive. So really our focus has been doing some of the newer stuff that we're trying to do through programs and program offerings. So we started a tour. And when I first tried to advertise the tour, I was really caught up in the name. What name do I use? Am I going to use the wrong name? So I initially, when I launched the tour, I call it the fishing Rancho tour. It's going to be a tour about the fishing ranchos. We received so many calls from people asking how big the charter boat for our fishing tour was. So in terms of marketing a cultural program, there was some disconnect from our existing audience in what the program was, just from using the wrong name in the title. So by calling the fishing Rancho tour, people thought it was a fishing tour, like a chartered fishing expedition where people go and catch fish. So I quickly changed the name, and I actually changed the name to the Latino history tour. I chose the word Latino because instead of Latine, which is what I usually use in terms of the marketing purposes, because concerns that Latine or Latinx would be seen as especially by members of the Latina community or Spanish speakers, as a misspelling or a spelling error by saying Latine. And also people maybe not in the Latina community, vast majority of Fort Myers Beach are English speakers, and white non-Latinos, non-Hispanics, according to the US Census. So trying to reach out to our existing audience, the town, being a town property, our primary community is, the residents of Fort Myers Beach. So by using Latine or Latinx, there'd probably be a lot of confusion and thus hesitation, and then not showing up to learn about this history, and would often add, a huge 5-10 minute long discussion on terminology. So the terminology has definitely been a huge challenge. A second challenge has really been the lack of tangible objects. What you see behind me is really the only representation, the physical representation of the 150-year history of the Latino settlement of the Mound House. Something I'm hoping to expand in my new role as a museum manager is really to expand the entirety of the 2,000 years of cultural and environmental history of Fort Myers Beach, as we are tasked with our mission. 3 out of the 6 exhibits at Mound House are about the last 50 years of the Mound House's history, about the Anglo-American history. Even the Calusa have only 2 out of the 6 exhibits about the Calusa at the Mound House Museum. So, the exhibits that we have, they're excellent exhibits, but it has been 8 years since we opened, so perfect time to start thinking about changing and adapting our existing permanent exhibits, and really reflecting this true diverse and inclusive history of our site, but also the diverse and inclusive place we want to build as a community to the ever expanding fabric of Southwest Florida. So a couple big picture challenges. But yeah, there has been some challenges for sure.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I am glad that you've been able to overcome those challenges. I didn't know that originally you had called the tour the fishing Rancho tour, and the people were calling, for a boat uh, type of tour. So it's still something that is very challenging. It is something that we're all still trying to navigate what it means, what the heck does Latinidad even mean in that ancient for during your talk. This is something that at the end of the day you need to be, however a person really wants to identify, whether that is Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Latinx. Other questions out there that somebody would like to ask Adam?
No, I just want to wish Adam good luck in getting that exhibit updated and more inclusive. I think that is an important next step after the hurricane.
Well, I think that this is talking to us. Indeed, I agree. So, Adam, thank you so much for teaching us so much about the ranchos and for your incredible. And if you can find more information and Adam's contact info on the website, if you see on the comments, there's a link for the están dando nuestra historia events and the next or upcoming virtual Cafecito lectures as well. There is an event this Saturday at Marco Island Historical Museum from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So if you're around the area, I hope you can enjoy it. And this recording the recording of this presentation will also be available on YouTube. So thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see you next time. Thank you again, Adam.
Thank you so much.